Okay, hello. My name is Dr. Brandon Fathy and I'm a lecturer in medieval archaeology here at the University of Reading. I've been at the university for a couple of years as a lecturer, and before that I spent a bit of time with a stint in commercial archaeology at ULAS, where I excavated Leicester Cathedral, which was a really cool site. So today I'll be talking about early medieval urbanism, so towns in the first half of the Middle Ages, especially in Britain. So urbanism in this particular period is really fascinating to me. At the beginning of the period, after the end of the Western Roman Empire, towns more or less disappeared from Britain. So even some of the most significant and largest towns like London or Canterbury appear to have been just about abandoned, or maybe there were a few minor settlements that survived inside of them, but that's it. Effectively, the entire island had returned to an agrarian society by, say, the year 500. And yet, by the second half of the Middle Ages, of course, there were real major towns, particularly London, but of course also places like York and Norwich, which were major urban centres in the second half of the Middle Ages. So the big question that motivates my research, that I'm really interested in, is how do these towns and cities come about? What are the origins of urbanism? How do people go from living in agricultural societies and farms and villages, and what makes them go and live in cities? So this early medieval period is really interesting for someone who studies urbanism or someone who's interested in urbanism, because it's a period where we have a decline of the Roman Empire, apparently in a society which had once been somewhat urbanized but isn't anymore, and they had to sort of re-blossom, right? A sort of spring returning from this kind of urban winter in the early Middle Ages. So I'm particularly interested in a type of settlement or a type of town, which some medievalists call wicks or emporia. And these are these kind of strange half-urban trading settlements which appeared in Northern Europe, mainly in Britain and Northern Continental Europe and Scandinavia. London Wick is an example of these. So London, for instance, Roman London, Londinium as it's sometimes called, was entirely abandoned in the early Middle Ages. And one of the reasons we know this is because the street grid of London today and in the Middle Ages is entirely different from the Roman street grid. So the roads in London today completely go over fora and bathhouses and amphitheatres as if they weren't even there. And that suggests to us that there was no continuity of urban form in Londinium, for instance. All the buildings were abandoned and torn down. The walls which used to surround London perhaps were maintained, with some of the gates surviving well into the early modern period. But the walls on the foreshore were removed. And after the Roman Empire left Britain and Londinium kind of went into collapse and decline, a few hundred years later, a new settlement appeared just about a kilometre to the west of Londinium, a site which we now call London Wick, which is roughly the location of Covent Garden or Aldwych. And London Wick is one of these emporium sites. And what's really interesting about it is that it has a number of urban characteristics. So it has plots, which look quite different from the rural villages around, say, in the Thames Valley. It had metalled roads, which was quite unusual for an early medieval settlement. It was quite large, covering several hectares, and appears to be quite populated. We know that there are charters from the Anglo-Saxon period by West Saxon kings granting certain people privileges or rights to trade, or levying taxes on imports coming into the town. There is an 8th century monk from Northumbria named Bede, who wrote this astonishing book called The History of the English. It's one of the first kind of narratives of the English people, and he describes London Wick as an emporium, as a mart of many nations, where people came near and far by land and sea to trade. And we see evidence of that in the archaeology of London Wick. So even though the old Roman London city of Londinium was abandoned at this time, and there is limited archaeological evidence of habitation there. Just a kilometre to the west in Covent Garden, we find this huge wealth of evidence of trade, including foreign coins, pottery from continental Europe, or pottery from other parts of Britain. And it wasn't just a trading centre, we also find a lot of evidence of crafting, right? So there's evidence, for instance, of blacksmithing, perhaps more finer examples of non-ferrous metalworking, such as, for instance, coppersmithing. Find evidence of antelope bone working, perhaps woodworking. So it's an economically productive place as well as a place of exchange. But at the same time, the Emporium is quite interesting because they only lasted for a few hundred years, and they weren't necessarily the sites of ecclesiastical centres. So in continental Europe, there's a long tradition, sort of, in France or Germany, the Low Countries, of seeing cathedrals as being really critical places in terms of the story of urban development. But what's quite interesting is that the cathedral in London, presumably located at the same site as the modern St. Paul's Cathedral, is actually in the old Roman city, which was otherwise largely abandoned. And this Emporium site, with all of this economic activity, this sort of hive of business, was beyond in this extramural site outside. And we can see other examples of emporia around Northern Europe. So I'm particularly interested, for instance, in Ipswich, which is on the River Orwell on the Suffolk coast. Other examples include Hamwick in what's now Southampton, and Joffawick and later Jorvik, which is a site in what's now York. And we also have examples in continental Europe and Scandinavia also. A lot of these sites are really well excavated, and they have a really rich archaeological material with really abundant evidence of craft production, like pottery making or bead making, glass working, and so on. And there's a lot of evidence of them inter-trading and trading with one another. Okay, so for instance, if you want to do an archaeology of urban emergence at these sites, what I like to do is start with the archaeology of the place and work backwards. So for instance, my specialty is in the Emporium of Ipswich. So what I would do Ipswich is I would look at the archaeology of Ipswich and see how Ipswich might have looked in, say, the year 1000, right? What evidence there are for plot boundaries, for roadways, for crafting sectors or quarters, for domestic habitation, for cemeteries. Trace what the place looks like spatially on a map as a town, and then start peeling back the layers of the archaeology. Work our way backwards to your 900, 800, 700, and see how far back we can go in time until we find a place that doesn't look urban at all. In the case of Ipswich, we have a place which was effectively entirely not urban, say, or very, very unurban by the year 600. So in 600, all there was at Ipswich were a couple of cemeteries not apparently associated with any known settlements, much less a town. And then what I'm able to do in my work is then try to fill in the gaps and show how in between the year 600 and say 900, this place emerged or unfolded through all these different interesting relationships with different places. So for instance, one case study I often like to mention at Ipswich is this roadway which emerged at what's now Franciscan Way in the western side of the town. And this place seemed to have started out as perhaps just a grazing area where farmers or pastoralists might have grazed their livestock, and there was a well at the site. And then later on in the 7th century, there was a ditch which appears in this excavation. And the ditch runs sort of southwest, adjacent to the River Gipping. And my favourite interpretation of this ditch, which is otherwise kind of empty in the area, is that this was a flood control channel. The idea being that you can't stop floods from happening, but you control the direction of where floodwaters run. And we can see a series of intercutting ditches on top of each other, and that suggests that these ditches were frequently redug as the centuries went on, until by the second half of the 9th century, this area had a roadway and a blacksmithing sector nearby. And my favourite interpretation of this is that this roadway started out as what we would today call the Desire Path, which you might have seen if you've kind of been walking around towns and cities in the world today. These paths where people tread the grass and decide their own route they want to take, regardless of the kind of planned paths or roads that exist. So I might imagine, for instance, that this roadway appeared as people began to walk from the estuary up or down the river. So if one were on the foreshore, on the beach, in Anglo-Saxon Ipswich and they wanted to walk upriver, they might have, instead of encountering the River Gipping, which is the nearby river, would have first encountered this ditch, this flood control channel. And so they would have used that as a kind of guideline to tell them, so to speak, where to walk up and down. And this might have tread the grass and made it a bit muddier, which might have encouraged yet more people to walk up and down, which might have tread the grass further. And you know how this works in this kind of feedback loop. And eventually an informal kind of trackway might have appeared. And with an increasing flow of potential clients walking up and down on this trackway, some entrepreneuring blacksmiths might have seen this as a place where they could intercept some potential customers. And so some began to set up workshop there, set up a forge, and perhaps they would repair tools or make equipment. And the blacksmith being there would only have encouraged more people to travel along that route. And so we can almost see as a roadway sort of spontaneously emerging. And I think that's a really great example of different features of how towns come about. There's all of these different actors or agents, craftspeople and kings, but also rivers and gravel and grass, and they're all kind of interacting in such a way that they're almost sort of negotiating, creating the town from the bottom up, which is one of the key themes of my research when I think about urban emergence. The question of how these emporia emerged has remained a quite contentious question, actually, in urban studies. And originally, the studies, or originally the models of urban emergence were based around ideas of kind of royal projects. That there was a king who was rationally thinking about the economy and therefore was creating or ordering or having ordered the creation of these towns to control long distance trade. And the model used to be that these kings were creating these emporia effectively to funnel in trade, to access to taxes or to prestige, exotic elite goods that would allow them to express their authority. Over the last 20 years or so, though, there's been increasing move to looking for more complex models of urban emergence, one that relates to other factors in the kind of story of how these towns first began to appear. So, for instance, we know that there was, first of all, a lot of trade going on along the coasts of Northern Europe, these kind of communities of seafarers who were trading goods up and down the coast. And what's quite interesting from a point of view of archaeological evidence is we see the artifacts that these people traded, particularly pottery. And what's quite telling about the distribution of these artifacts across, say, Britain or Northern Europe is that these artifacts are not being funneled into particular sites. So if kings were establishing emporia as these kind of sites to control and restrict trade, they weren't very successful. It seems that actually there were active trading communities effectively just beaching their ships up and down the seaside all around the North Sea and the English Channel and the Baltic Seas in the early Middle Ages. And at the same time, we also know that inland there was something of an agricultural proliferation in this period. There's really interesting research looking at pollen evidence, for instance, in England, showing how there was an intensification of agriculture, particularly during the 8th century, when there was a rise of new types of estates, sort of the predecessors of the later medieval manor, and agricultural production really began to flourish in this period. So we have these two things happening at the same time. On one hand, we have the rise of agriculture, or not the rise, but the increase of agriculture. It's proliferating, it's intensifying. And on the other hand, we have these maritime communities trading at the periphery of these more inland rigid societies. So we have agricultural surplus beginning to emerge perhaps on one hand, and then potential early forms of commercialization on the other. And when these intersect, it creates a new type of settlement potentially, which are these emporia sites. So for instance, at Ipswich, the very early century of Ipswich, the 7th century, has a very interesting archaeological record. So at Ipswich, there were two cemeteries, two large barrow cemeteries, one on either side of the river, the side of Buttermarket at the north, and the side of Stoke Quay to the south. The Stoke Quay cemetery is particularly cool because it has these large burial mounds with these furnished graves, that is, burials with grave goods, like a slightly less wealthy version of Sutton Hoo, say. And on the other hand, we find mixed in the burial soil of this site, and also in other sites upriver from Ipswich, we find huge quantities, relative to this period, huge quantities of imported pottery, especially from the Rhineland, the Low Countries, and what's now northern France. So this suggests that there are two things going on at this time. First of all, that there were people coming to these cemeteries for funerals, and also that there was trade coming through the estuary, including seaborne trade, maritime trade, coming through the estuary, and both trade and funerary activities were happening at the same time. There's a lot of interesting archaeological research and kind of anthropological analogies which are made about how some of these early and middle Anglo-Saxon funerals, especially in the pagan early Christian periods, were a really important place for sort of status signification, right? That at these funerals, the grave would be laid with these really expensive and valuable grave goods, and that would be a way of expressing the wealth or power of these elites in society. And perhaps also a bit more kind of cognitively, this would be a way of helping these people transform from kind of members of the living community into ancestors who could be revered or worshipped, with a burial mound, these large burial mounds, existing as kind of a place that these people could be recognized. And so what we might have at Ipswich is, on one hand, a place where we have these seafaring communities trading, perhaps intermittently, opportunistically along the coast, but then also we have these gatherings of communities from the inland, where people are perhaps coming from inland Suffolk to the estuary. And this inland community at these funeral events may have created a reliable body of customers for these seafarers to arrive at. And so we might have these two components interacting, right? On one hand, we have agricultural surplus, and we have kind of expected communities or populations grouping together. And on the other hand, we have these almost commercialized seafaring communities, which are trading opportunistically. And when these two combine, it creates this kind of new structure, which is greater than the sum of their parts. I'd like to kind of make an analogy almost between, imagine a molecule, that the properties of water is different from the properties of hydrogen or oxygen, right? When they combine in just the right way, the properties of something new. So these two events mixing in just the right way would have created a new form of settlement, or a new form of life, which is urban living. And so a kind of seasonal marketplace might have appeared, where it became opportunistic for certain people to come to the estuary and trade. There's a lot of interesting research that in the kind of early and middle Anglo-Saxon economy, a lot of agricultural communities, farmers, used to engage in kind of skilled but part-time crafts. So a full-time farmer might be particularly skilled, for instance, in making pottery, or in carving antler combs, or combs out of antler, or combs out of bone. And then they would use that to kind of supplement their income and trade in certain seasons, perhaps in the summer, would travel around and trade these goods for a bit of extra resources before returning back to their home farm, their home base for the harvest. And so these kind of trading centers might have begun to emerge as a convenient hub where all of these different farming communities might have gathered together, where they could have traded perhaps their surplus, right, surplus crops, or particular kind of cash crops, maybe like peas, or might have been able to trade in livestock, in addition to these kind of crafts. And over time, as these sites became more and more important, it might have become advantageous for farmers to start trading and crafting a little bit earlier and earlier in the spring, or a bit later and later into the harvest, until eventually it became opportunistic for some to stay there all year round. And eventually what started out as a seasonal trading place might have sort of ossified or fossilized into a permanent trading settlement. And this is how the town began. What I think is really cool about the archaeology of Ipswich is that it shows that there wasn't a village here which gradually grew as the population expanded into a town, and then gradually grew as population expanded into a city, but rather the town is something qualitatively different. It's not that a town is just a quantitatively larger village. It's a qualitatively different type of settlement where people would engage in trading activities. Effectively, in my mind, kind of crafting and shopping are essential characteristics of a town, right? And then once you have a settlement which is engaged in that type of activity at scale, then it becomes a very different type of settlement. And it's through this process of these two different worlds kind of emerging in this estuary, and then this kind of seasonal marketplace perhaps gradually becoming a permanent settlement, that new type of settlement appeared without ever having to rely on this kind of linear progression from small to medium to large settlement, right? Instead, it emerged from the kind of ossification of what started out as a kind of ephemeral activity, and then a town appeared. And then once a permanent urban settlement appeared, then these new populations would have to have learned to sort of negotiate new social norms and etiquette and laws, new ways of living together. If you think about it, this might have been one of the few places in Northern Europe at the time where people might have lived with strangers, that effectively the next door neighbour wouldn't have been kin or related to them in certain ways. And so they've have to have negotiated new ways of living together, right? Marketplaces had to establish a kind of minimum threshold of trust, for instance, right? For someone to go to the market, they would have to know that someone wouldn't immediately return and rob them, right? So it's not to say that these early medieval markets had to be devoid of cheaters, but the markets would have to have had a kind of minimum threshold of trust for these urban communities to be able to rely on one another, and to begin to live with one another, at least kind of minimum threshold of harmony. And once that was established, then all of these kind of social frameworks and material infrastructure would have reinforced one another. So like the example I gave earlier about the trackway emerging into a road, once infrastructure exists, it encourages more and more people to come. So we have, again, this kind of circular causality, right? There's a feedback loop. Once the city has become a permanent place, and once kind of urban social norms and etiquette have been established, then they're self-reinforcing, and the town continues without necessarily needing a huge amount of top-down royal investment.